That was different than the test thing. It says it's live. Good afternoon. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes and I'll jump right in. And while we wait, you get to listen to some of the birds that are singing in the background. I don't have some of the really exciting ones that were singing earlier today, but there's a few of them singing. You can tell me if you can hear what that is behind me. I see some folks dropping in from Alaska. Brittany Sweeney, Jennifer Jones. Yeah, I had some technical difficulties jumping on. I usually do lives from my phone, and today I'm trying it from the laptop. It was just a tad bit different. So let me go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to attempt to not talk too much because I think this could be a little bit more fruitful if I can attempt to answer some questions. But I do want to provide some context. And first, welcome friends, partners of John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge at Tennecum, as well as anyone else who jumped in today um, to have some conversation about some difficult issues that are happening in our community here in Philadelphia and beyond, and the outdoor world at large, really. It seems like our our country is being rocked to death, and I think folks want to talk about it. I think it's a good time to talk about it. It's not something that is just a thing that happened recently. It's something that I would say much of white America hasn't been able to grasp or get its eyes on, but it's been happening throughout all of my life and before. It's not a new phenomenon. That's all I'm saying. But it's hard to have to see it and have context with it if you don't really have to face it every day. Um, it is it's an interesting and depressing thing that we face. It's something that feels like as a black man that's on a repeat in our society. So I can tell you that as I started thinking about this, and I wasn't sure if folks were really going to want to talk about it, I put that question out there, and enough folks responded to our Facebook message that they really thought it would be a good idea to talk. I'm hoping it will be. Um, I can tell you, I started typing what to say today and realized that it just really needed to be a relational conversation. I want to just provide you guys some context, and context related to what this looks like for me. So someone who knows me, you'll have a little bit of that context if I've ever shared any stories with you, because some of the injustices that we've seen, and we can talk about the killings that we're seeing in our country, unjust killings that we're seeing in our country, but it's more than that. There are other things that happen, and I'm going to try to tie it in just to how this impacts the outdoor world. Um, as you know, at John Heinz, we are doing everything we can to engage an audience that hasn't really been engaged directly in the conservation world. Here at John Heinz, um, outside our Philadelphia entrance, it's a very high percentage African American population. And at John Hines, we take very seriously how we can engage that audience at all levels. So to us, that's K through employment. I believe that it has to be that. I mean, for years, the conservation world at large, not just the John Heinz, has really struggled with that, and we struggle with that, I believe, because we generally engage people who fit in what our category is, whether it's our ethnicity, the clubs that we're in, the groups that we hang out with after work. So you generally engage with those folks. Hopefully, you know someone that is from the African American community that you can ask more questions to after today. So let me give you a little bit of context in how what you saw in Christian Cooper in the park with the young woman who had the dog and she called the cops and she made up those lies right on camera where we were all able to see it. Let me provide some context in how that comes home for me. And please ask other people to talk about these sorts of things with you because it's a deeper conversation. Those sorts of conversations, I've never had anyone call the cops on me because I asked them to put their dog on a leash, but I've had people call the cops on me before. But let me give you context from a man who would describe himself as a naturalist, photographer, gardener. I love the outdoors. I'm an outdoor enthusiast, and anything that I can get my hands to in the outdoors, it's just something that pleases me. I'm gonna give you a story from when I was young, and I was very young, probably under 10 years old. A lot of my time in my childhood was spent, um, and I got teased for this, hanging out in the wetlands that were nearby my home in Trenton, New Jersey. And I got little nicknames. One of them was Wild Boy. I spent time building rafts that I promptly sunk into the wetlands on the Delaware River, catching frogs, whatever you would say about it. So I got teased both in my community, but also kind of looked at funny from white America. In my community, it was, we don't do that sort of thing. The reality was, some of us did those sorts of things, but you never really knew those stories. Um, some years ago, I was on a trip. I told you I like to do photography. I was on a trip up to northern New Hampshire to do photography. I love shooting photos. One of my favorite seasons is in the wintertime. I was up there shooting, and it was after a really big snowstorm, and I rented a cottage up there. And I usually get out pretty early in the morning because I love the early light when after it snows and how that light reflects off the snow, the shadows that are created as the moon is moving across the snow, as the light comes up. Some of the best lighting to create some pretty amazing photos. Well, I usually get up really early and I scope out the area, I do my shooting, and then I stopped in to eat at a diner. This is some context that will help you understand how it feels when you experience, um, I'll say prejudice or racism, whichever you use. I walked into a diner, and it's a really small town um, called Errol, New Hampshire. Tiny town, maybe about 400 to 500 people. That's it. Pulled into the diner. There were snowmobiles parked in the parking spaces, and I walked upstairs to get to the main floor, and the diner froze. They were talking as I was coming up the stairs, but as soon as I made level, whole diner froze. And I'm looking around, and it was, okay, what are you going to say to this? Saying that to myself. What I ended up saying was, I waited, it felt like it was 5 minutes, that it was probably only about 15 to 20 seconds. And I just said, how's it going? Everybody kind of turned around, finished, continued to do whatever it was they were doing. Waitress saw what was going on and she came over to serve me. So that's one of those moments that you feel like you don't really belong there. Um, if that was my brother, either one of my brothers or my sister or cousin, that would have made them never want to go to that town again. That's the kind of thing that it feels like when people say things and do things that make you feel like you don't really belong in a location that you're in, doing something that you really enjoy to do. I've had more experiences up in that that neck of the world before. But if I talk about the birding community a little bit, I'm gonna give you some other examples. I'm just going to give you one more example. I have a lot of stories. I'm picking some that you might be able to relate with. Another story is bird watching. I've been bird watching probably for 24, 25 years. And I've bird watched pretty much all over the country from Maine to Florida, from Southern California all the way up to British Columbia. Love bird watching. I used to be a crazy bird watcher. I was a bird chaser. Someone reported something, I would do everything I can to try to get that bird. Then I read this book called The Kingbird Highway, and after reading that book, I looked at myself. It's like, you are crazy, because that was me, running around trying to have a big year. So how many birds can you get in a year? And I stopped chasing after that. I still love bird watching, but I stopped chasing birds. Um, so in many of the places that I've bird watched in north the northeastern U.S., many of the places that I bird watched in those places, because bird watching is kind of an elitist culture, subculture in the U.S. Usually, it's older white men that have a lot of money, and that doesn't describe everyone, but usually that's what it was, and that's kind of what I ran into. I could tell you that a lot of those interactions were very cold and standoffish. Now, I think some of them are about the elitist culture that is bird watching, but other times it it definitely feels more than that. Like, well, how did you get into this? Why are you out here, or watching you when you get too close to a vehicle? That sort of thing happens all the time. It's I can tell you it's been frustrating throughout my life, not to the point where it stops me. I put a post up last week that talked about that. This has happened throughout my career, um, both in Fish and Wildlife Service, but also just kind of walking out on the trail. And these things hit your mind, they hit your heart, and you feel saddened by them. And if you're already really passionate about it, it's not going to stop you. But if you're not passionate about it, it's going to shut you down, and you're not going to want to engage in that field anymore, or that activity anymore. That's what we face. These are barriers that it's not like it's in a book that you need to do these things. These are barriers that you face when you're a ethnically different person that has darker skin in the United States. It happens, and it's not everybody. Just want to make that clear. It's not everybody, but it is a culture that we have, and it's it's difficult. It's difficult. It hits my ears, it hits my heart, and it makes me think, why am I out there? But at the same time, I have enough passion that I just drive right through it. That is not even close to everyone. I have some people that work with me today, that I've worked with in the past, that this weighs on their mind heavily every day, and they question if they're in the right field. They question, do they have friends that care about them? And I will say that if you are a part of white America, I encourage you, as you think about these things, as you think about the injustices we're seeing on TV, as you think about how you see people treating black and brown faces out on the trail and such, that you not be afraid of asking questions, that you not be afraid of stepping up to come alongside and suffer with those folks who are feeling pressurized. You're going to say the wrong thing. It's going to happen. I can tell you that that's not going to bother me. If I hear the wrong question being asked, I'm just going to help you get to your question, because I know you're trying. It it feels a little worse when people say nothing, because you make all kinds of assumptions when people say nothing, including me. I do the same thing. If someone's not saying anything, it's like they really agree with this. And It's not a good look. You end up making stories up, and it makes you do things that you ought not do. Um, Now, I also put a little bit of that on my own shoulders, and I'll sometimes ask questions to folks to try to get the ball rolling. Try to put myself out on the front of the question or the conversation to get people to open up. And some folks will still not open up for fear that they might say the wrong thing. And I will never string a person up for saying the wrong thing. It is helpful when you ask a question or when you say, I really feel for what's going on. It's helpful. I don't need to have that, but it's helpful when you do it because it moves the conversation forward. It lets me know that there's support out there. You see what's happening, and you want to encourage a more inclusive workspace, either in the conservation world or an inclusive space that's doing photography, someone going out fishing. That's really helpful for you to ask those questions. So I'm going to try to address also a couple of questions that folks have sent in on our Facebook page. Um, One of the questions was if it fits with the program. Well, I'm not going to read that whole question for you, but what are some of the barriers that are out there that inhibit Black folks from engaging in the outdoors? Or should I say, how do you remove the barriers that hinder underrepresented groups? Or I'll say systematically excluded groups in the conservation space. Some of the barriers that are out there, and this wasn't a barrier for me because, again, I was crazy. Um, One of the barriers is when people don't see people that look like them in the field, or if they don't see people who look like them, bird watching, fishing, whatever. I can remember stories when I was a kid. My parents and grandparents alike would say, "There ain't no Black people out there," and that was enough fear for my brothers and sisters to not engage at all. But again, I was crazy, so I just kept plowing forward. It would really help if in whatever organization you're in, whatever hobby that you're engaged in the outdoors, and this fits for not just the outdoors, anywhere, that you try to make sure that folks are representative of the communities that you're trying to reach and serve. That's huge. I can tell you when I first saw the first Black biologist, I was elated. I didn't need the person to be there for me because I'm kind of out on the edge because I was already really passionate about it. But when I first saw that person, and it was two at the same time, which was crazy, in the middle of Tennessee, I was shocked. And it gave me even more excitement. I see it on the faces of the kids that my education program staff here at John Heinz, when they're going into those classrooms and they're seeing people that look like them, they're so excited. It's hard to describe what that's like, but I can tell you what it feels like for me and what it feels like for my staff. It feels like you just won the lottery, and you don't need money to win that lottery. Um, there are other things too. What do people feel safe in your space? So how are people going to feel safe in your space? So at John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge, the only way that I see is a really good way to feel safe in our space is to know the community. So you know the community by going to the community. Um, that breaks down a barrier. If they've never been there, if our uniforms look like police uniforms, they really do. When we first started meeting with the community, I started wearing just our polo shirt. It doesn't look like this. It looks more like a friendly, approachable shirt. That's what I started wearing. As the community got to know me, I was comfortable with going in with this uniform. They were more comfortable with me. Why? Because we started a relationship. That's another barrier. There's a fear of just not being wanted there, and so it's you want somebody that looks like you. A lot of people are in that category, or you don't feel like you're wanted there. The stories that you heard as a kid might have said they don't want us there. Bad things happen when we go there, or you just haven't spent a whole lot of time in the outdoors where you don't see a lot of concrete. So you break that barrier down by meeting people in their community. right where their local parks are, if there are local parks there. So there's a lot of other things that I could roll into that, but I don't want to go too long on it. Another question was about that came in online was about how come John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge does most of his programming in Philadelphia, not the Delaware County side. It's big refuge. About three-quarters of the refuge is in Delaware County. The other percentage is in Philadelphia. The reality is we want to serve everyone, but we are very deliberate about reaching out to systematically excluded groups. These are groups that we haven't reached out to in the conservation world. We're very deliberate about that, very intentional about it. And it doesn't mean that we don't serve Delaware County. We do. We service the schools in Delaware County all the time. We deliver programming to the schools in Delaware County. And I bring this up just to say, if you're going to try to right the ship and be more inclusive about how we engage communities, you will have to slant it a little in the other direction so that you can start to make sure folks feel safe in coming into your space. Doesn't mean you don't do anything in the other spaces, but we are targeted. You can't do everything. So that I hope that kind of answers that question. Um, so how many of you guys, I can't see your answers right now because I have a part of my screen showing. How many of you guys know who would describe themselves as Black naturalists out there? And I'm not going to use anyone who, well, one of them might be well known. I'm going to use some contemporaries, people who are Black naturalists that I respect a great deal. And not just because, oh, they were Black naturalists. That's not why. It's, I like how they do their business. Right at my station here, Brianna Mingwa. She is an education program supervisor, but she would describe herself as a naturalist and more than a budding bird watcher now, very inquisitive, very sharp. And she was someone, a contemporary of mine, that is a naturalist. Um, I'll also describe Monica Williams, a biologist, is down in our southeastern region of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Self-described naturalist. She is a biologist, is now turned into a manager, and she kind of fits the same line that I'm in. We are out there, but people don't really know. I like to think we're relatively quiet. Bree's not relatively quiet, but that's a good thing. She's probably laughing right now. um, Another one, advice to folks that are considering to being involved in this. You don't see a lot of us as Black and brown faces out in the conservation world, but there are many ways to get in. Here at Heinz, we start our programming at the high school level, like the job program, obviously at the high school level. We engage at the K through 9 area, but we also do hiring once they get to high school. If you're in Philadelphia, look online with partners that we work with. We have worked with the Student Conservation Association. We have worked with Mobilize Green. And both of those organizations recruit in the local high schools. So ask those questions. We have connections with many of the high schools in Philadelphia. You can also look online. Look online in USA Jobs. USA Jobs is tough. It's complicated to apply for a job through USA Jobs. You find all kinds of government jobs on there. But we use programs like these high school youth hiring programs to connect you to what we do at that permanent hire phase. So we bring folks on in high school through our partners, and we train them up, and then we move them into some other youth jobs. Some of the ways are to connect with your science teachers if they're connected with John Heinz, and that's how you connect. Refuges across the country, National Wildlife Refuges across the country work with high school kids. I don't know how many of those refuges really connect the dots with high school to college age programs to permanent programs, but we do that pretty deliberately to try to make sure that we can move some of those kids along who are really interested into the conservation world. They don't have to be into the Fish and Wildlife Service. They could be somewhere else in the conservation world, or more yet, better yet, maybe they're going to go be a developer somewhere and they're going to pick up some conservation values that they will take into their line of work. That is a success story for us at John Heinz. It's trying to help you deepen your connection with the resource. So, what can you do? I mentioned this earlier. What can you do to try to um, be more, to make spaces like this more inclusive? When you see a problem, say something about it. If you see someone that feels like they're kind of getting a cold shoulder, walk up to them and take them by the hand, so to speak. In this day and age, you got to be careful with what's happening with COVID, but take them by the hand, encourage them, help them identify some things that they're seeing out on the trail. If you see something happening that looks like it's pushing that person away from what's happening, maybe it's fishing, maybe it's bird watching, maybe it's plant identification, maybe it's kayaking, and they look a little scared, and someone might be leaning against them a bit in a way that pushes them away, say something that can encourage that person. Also, say something to the other person. I don't want you to get into something that could turn physical, obviously, but let someone know that's not a really nice thing to say, and encourage the person to continue on. So I'm going to move into other questions that are popping up right now. Let's see what you guys have here. Here we go. So one of the questions is asking me to share a moment in nature when I felt like I actually belonged, and that your presence as a black man is important. I've had those moments for sure. Everything hasn't been negative. In fact, I've had a lot of great experiences, worked with a lot of great people in Fish and Wildlife Service who I feel really care about my experience and what I've learned and what I have to contribute. Um, I'm going to go back to, well, that's a little close, but I'll go back to about 1999, no, maybe 2000, about 2000. I got knock it, a knock on, not my door, my cube, when I was down in Virginia working at Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And my supervisor asked me to come into his office. And he said, close the door. I closed the door and he said, I think you're going to go far in this agency. And I was a little bit confused by what he was talking about. He had gotten a phone call from someone that said, I really need Lamar to come and work with me. Come and work for me. I think he can help us move some things forward in monitoring and surveying in Fish and Wildlife Service. And then he told me who it was who gave him the call. That felt good in that someone who was not a person of color calling my supervisor to say he wanted me to come work with him to help move what we were doing in Region 5 forward in the biological programming. That felt really good. It felt important. I don't need people to say that all the time, obviously. He could have just told me, so-and-so said to give you a call. Actually, I'm going to say the guy's name. His name was Hal Laskowski. Had contacted someone and said that he wanted to bring me on. So that felt good to me. I've had some other moments in leading bird walks in a number of places where it felt like after getting to know people, after they realized that, okay, he does know what he's talking about here, where I felt as though, okay, that feels good too, where they begin to think, oh, he knows what he's saying. let's listen. That felt good. So thanks for that question, Bria. I've been working for Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a question from Iriana, and I've been working for Fish and Wildlife Service probably for about 25 years now. Um, and if I were to give advice on someone who wants to work for Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm going to say volunteer. If you can't get a job right away, volunteer, get your name out there. Um, there's a lot of volunteer opportunities throughout the Fish and Wildlife Service and the conservation world. But also look for those internship jobs. Depending where you are, look for those internship jobs. If you're about to go into college, do not pass up the opportunity to find an internship. You might be thinking, I'm going to go work down at the beach, selling ice cream or something, or selling pizza, or delivering something. But if you know you might have even the smallest interest in engaging in the outdoors or working in a conservation organization, find a job where, or a volunteer opportunity where you can get your name out there and people get to know who you are. That's what I would say. It's really important to do that. Um, I've worked in the Fish and Wildlife Service for a long time, and I listen to the conversations, both working in the field and working in the regional office. And when people know you and they can speak to your skills, your passion, your drive, that goes a long way in those conversations. And when your name shows up on a certificate for employment, you kind of get a little bit of notch that raises you up. So that's what I would say to that. Any thoughts out there about what you've been seeing and hearing since the nation has been rocked and how that relates to the conservation world? And as you're thinking about that, I'm just going to emphasize again, when you're out there, have conversations with people. You don't know how good it feels for, like, you have black people on the spectrum of, I need to be engaged whenever something terrible happens, or I need to be engaged not so much. You don't have to engage me all the time. It feels good. It feels good to hear from people that say they're thinking about it and they're trying to understand it more. That always feels good. But I'm not that person that has to have that contact. But I know a lot of people who do. They really need that contact. Checking more questions. All right. Um, so this person, Kimberly, thank you. Speaking with local partners about being intentional about getting black people into our state and federal parks in our local area, but we realize that we're a group of all white faces. How can we as a group of white people get the ball started? That is never easy. It's not easy going in the reverse direction either. It's just not easy. I'll tell you though, it's not impossible. Um, I could tell you that I play a part in um, virtually all of our hiring at John Heinz. It takes time, a lot of intentionality, a lot of effort to make sure that you're getting your team thinking along the same lines. You need a committed decision maker at your station, office, whatever it is, to commit to that. That's the only way it's going to happen. If the decision maker is opposed, it's not going to go anywhere. Um, Now, have I seen places where that has changed? Only if someone above them has spoken into the conversation. It's the only time I've seen that. Now, if you have people who are kind of in the middle, um, I think a way to do that is one, set up a panel and stop saying this. I want the best candidate. And I'm going to get creamed for that by many of my colleagues. Stop saying, I want the best candidate, because the best candidate is very often someone who has had enough privilege to get the training, get the experience to make it to that list. That's usually the best candidate. They're well trained. What I say to my staff, and I can't tell you we're all on the same page with this, is we want the best fit for our station. And in my head, the best fit is that person is going to help us. They're going to be good, or they might need a little bit of training, but they're going to help us on our diversity fronts. And when I say diversity fronts, that doesn't just mean black and brown faces. It also means male and female. Because little kids, they need to see themselves not just in their ethnicity, but also a little boy often needs to see, oh, men do this too. And little girls need the same thing. So I'm always paying attention to that. And those are hard conversations to have with people that you know and you trust and you love that work with you, because they we are trained to have the best candidate. Best candidate for me is not the most well trained candidate. That's the best fit for the station. And that's how I would approach that. You've got to think about that. Think about panels and how you guide those panels to making those decisions. That's the short answer. It's a much longer answer than that, and it's not easy. You have to have allies on that panel at your station in your organization that really want to see a more inclusive space, a more inclusive workspace. And that's in how we recruit volunteers, how we recruit staff, how we draw interns in. And I participate not just in the interns, but I mean the permanent staff, but also in the intern hires. Um, or my deputy is on those panels if I can't be. It's important to play that role. Your leaders have to be there at the table, and you need to sell them on why it's important to have a more inclusive space. They have to be sold on that. Any other questions right there? So here's another one that came in. Who are my environmental heroes? So I'm going to start with Mamie Parker. Mamie Parker was one of those black biologists that I met when I first came in Fish and Wildlife Service. I got plopped down in the middle of Tennessee. There wasn't no brothers out there, I tell you that. But then I get there and I see Mamie and another person. And she was a hero to me because she fought through a lot of challenge, prejudice, difficulty. She had to deal with that. And she was running a program that was introducing young, ethnically diverse freshmen, sophomores, juniors into the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I somehow made it into that program. And we brought her back in other programs because she was such an inspirational speaker. I'll give you a couple others. There's a young woman who's no longer with Fish and Wildlife Service. Her name is Tyler Green. And I got to see her career from a very early age. She was still in college. And she became a very strong employee. And she's now working for EPA. But I saw her passion in trying to engage and connect with urban communities. Very skilled, very sharp, very passionate. So she's another one. I could go on and on those. So Kimberly, she has another one. A conversation I've had with another federal employee is that sometimes the factor that drives diversity hires away is how comfortable they feel in communities. I've heard that before. How do we make someone like your brothers and sisters feel more comfortable if they move to a largely white rural community where they might be a minority just to work there? That is very difficult. Someone like me, you could throw me into pretty much any community, but that's just the type of person I am. You're not going to be able to do that with everyone. I always say, my staff has heard this, people that I worked with in the regional offices heard this, pretty much everyone I talk to hears this. You have to provide a soft landing strip at the station that they're going to. And a soft landing strip is a space where it's not always about just the manager, the supervisor at that station. It's the volunteers that you have on board. It's the friend groups that you have on board. It's the other staff on board. The manager or the supervisor could do everything right to try to engage, and try to soften that landing strip to make it an easy landing strip. But if you have one or two people that are in that list that I just gave you that they don't want them there, they're going to be doing things out of sight of you and sometimes denying that those things happen. And that's going to really hurt. I would never send anyone just off the cuff, send anyone who is from one of these systematically excluded groups. I would never send them to a space where you know you have difficulty and don't have support on the ground. And that means you got a manager that is cognizant of the challenges that are at the station and they're working through them. I would also assign a mentor. That's pretty important. Um, and I've heard this question before, oftentimes from folks who they don't support it, and it's like, well, we don't have anybody here that or there that is going to support these folks. And sometimes that question is used to say, okay, we're not going to send anyone there. Sometimes it's an honest question trying to figure out how do we do that properly. And I'll tell you a personal story. When I got my second job in Fish and Wildlife Service, the offer was to go up to Vermont, and I remember it vividly. And I laughed today, but I was almost in tears when I was in my sophomore year. But I got an offer to go up to Vermont and work for the fisheries program, and I told my parents I was elated. And my parents said, there ain't no black people up there." So I was like, okay, I need to look this up. So I looked up how many black people were there. It was 3% blacks in the state of Vermont. And I really had to push to get my parents to allow me to go up there. It was so difficult because they were worried about what might happen to me up there. So my boss did something that I did not expect. I basically called him and I said, my parents won't let me go up there. They're afraid. And I told them why. Because there's no black people up there and they're worried about what might happen. My boss said, let me call you back. He talked to his wife and they invited me into their home for that summer. And that, and my parents drove up. That still wasn't enough. They drove up there with me for that situation. And now I was in my sophomore year in college. So they drove up there. That's a soft landing strip. And I'm not saying that that's what you need to do, but that was something that I didn't expect. I wasn't asking for. I needed to convince my parents that I was going to be safe. Or should I say my boss needed to do that. So if that helps. If you guys have no other questions, okay. Well, if you guys ever want to have other conversations related to this or other things, let us know on our Facebook page. This is something that I personally, and when I say something, I mean the racial challenges that we have in our country. I don't see this as something that will just disappear. I can tell you right now that um, this is something we'll always struggle with, and we'll struggle with it because we always go into a situation thinking about, okay, who's going to be there that's going to be accepting of me. We always go into those situations like that. Someone always wants to be up on another person. It's like that throughout, not just our country, but throughout our world. I could tell you that even in my community, there's something that I would loosely call shadeism. The lighter you are, the more elevated you're looked to. Um, the challenge in what people would depict as this struggle of black and white is that there's a majority and a minority. So it causes our organization, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the conservation world at large to be more intentional about how we approach these things. We can't just keep doing what we're doing. We have to intentionally think about how we do recruitment, how we do engagement, how we recruit volunteers, and everything else. We have to think about those things. And the next biggest thing is have conversations with people. if you're looking at your recruitment team, and your recruitment team does not reflect who you're trying to recruit at all, or you don't have opinions that are pushing you from the place in which you stand, whatever your foundation is, then you don't have the right team. If you find yourself coming to the everyone agreeing all the time, then you probably need to mix your team up a bit, because everyone cannot think alike on your team. You'll never be challenged to make a change. I can tell you, my team challenges me. They do. And you need people to do that so that you can see the other side of the conversation. Don't be afraid of that conversation. You're not going to offend me when you ask questions. You might say something that is totally out of this world that I might think in the back of my head that was pretty offensive. You're not going to hear that come out of my mouth in those words. It's going to be like, okay, how am I going to have this conversation in a way that's going to be fruitful for them to see it from my perspective and to suffer along with me so that we can get to a better place. That's where I want us to go. Um, that's where I think all of us need to go. Let me see here. It sounds like another question may have come up. This came from Angela. Do you have any advice for parents who want to help their young white children understand and be better in this space as we go forward? Oh, how do I answer that? Yeah, that's the funny thing. You can teach your children the best that you can, and my child, same thing. You can teach them the best things. Ultimately, they're going to have friends that are going to introduce other things into their lives. All you can do is give them the best that you have. People say, "Well, I let my kids play with." I've heard this. I let my kids play with black kids and hang out with black kids. It's like, yeah, that's good. That's fine. The world engages white kids and black kids very differently. Something that I have to think about when I go out on the street, when my son goes walking down the street, when he drives anywhere, I have to think about, is he going to get stopped at any point, or am I going to get stopped at any point? I have to actually think about that, and it's not just about getting stopped and getting a ticket. It's about, is he going to get stopped, or am I going to get stopped, and I'm going to make one wrong move, and then I'm not coming home. I have to process that. So maybe having conversations about those things with your children, so that they understand this power dynamic that we have in our country. You can't just write those things off. It's really good to understand that power dynamic. My son used to walk to high school here with his friends there in this neighborhood. All his friends were white, and they used to walk through this yard, and the person didn't really want them walking through that yard. But my son's the only black guy there. If something ever went down, and I used to say to him all the time, do not walk through that guy's yard, because if something goes down, the fingers pointed at him, he would be, he would get less leniency than the other kids would. Kids need to understand that power dynamic when they are urging the other kids that they're with to do this or do that. I think you got to have those conversations about what those power dynamics are like. Look into the history of our country. The history that I learned growing up in school was an abbreviated history of Black America. I got the real deal from college when I had a professor that said, "You're going to learn, and you're going to learn the right thing." And so I think looking for those educational opportunities, talking with your kids about the power dynamics that are there, and generally learning to feel, understand, suffer, and have conversations with those who are under pressure. And they have to think about things that are happening to them when they are going out in the world. I can tell you it happens when you walk into a store, and sometimes you're followed strictly because you look like me, to comments that are had in a supermarket, to thinking about whether I'm going to come home when I drive down the road. to the comments that I get if I'm hiking up Mount Mansfield in Vermont. And again, I can tell you, I write many of the small comments off. Some of them I take on straightforward. I take them on directly. Some of them it's just I can't. I've had enough. I can't do it. I have those days. I have those days. Um, so if you see me quiet when something is said, it's not because I don't want to take it on. It's because I've had enough and I can't take it on. And maybe I'll say something another day. So that's all I have for today. Unless there's more questions, I'm willing to stay on a little bit longer um, if more questions are popping in. Ding Darling wants to have a weekly discussion. I wish we were having these discussions all the time. Ding Darling is a national wildlife refuge in southern Florida. Um, yeah, I'd love to have these discussions all the time. I'm sure I would. It would be a little weighty, but they do need to happen. The fact that you might open a conversation up about this when you feel like I need to hear it, I love it. Bring it on. Well, you guys have a good day. If you do feel as though we need to have another conversation like this, let me know. Send a note to our Facebook page. My staff and me monitor that page, and we monitor those messages, and we'll do what we can to have those conversations. So, you guys take care. Have a good one, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon. And one person did say, just ask the question just now, will the video be available after streaming? Yes, it will be on our Facebook page. And if you have questions, other questions, I will respond to them or my staff will respond to them. Take care, everyone. And make sure you have those conversations with people. Don't be afraid to talk to people. I know it's like it's a little scary sometimes, but have the conversation. I will not bite your head off. You're going to see me processing when you ask a question that I might feel a certain kind of way about. But what I'm trying to do is figure out how to respond to you so that it helps you get your question answered and helps you move forward. So have a good one out there. Bye-bye.